until you come to the end of yourself, you cannot find God. Which is why, like in 12-step recovery, this is why I figured it out. I can't do it. I'm at the end of myself. And the problem with comfort and wealth in general is it has all these illusions of I can. But then, of course, the more you move into those spaces, the more you realize that in the core of those places, there's an I can't. Everybody gets there. It's just a longer journey because you have this illusion of I can for so much longer. And actually, it's kind of a poverty in reverse. It's like a deep, deep poverty, comfort and wealth, because it keeps you from the kingdom of God.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Great to be back for another week. If you're new to Inspired, we are bombarded relentlessly by bad news and fear in the media. And this is coming at a completely different spirit. It's introducing you to friends of mine from across the spectrum of a different life experience. And yeah, I have no doubt this week you'll be inspired because we've got with us Danielle Strickland. Welcome, Danielle.
Hey, Simon, great to be here.
Yeah, so good to have you. So you're in Vancouver right now. And in terms of introducing you, well, you talk of yourself as a sort of serial entrepreneur. We first came across each other maybe 8-10 years ago. You and I were both speaking at Home Focus and then New Wine, I think, in one summer. And you were there with your husband, Stephen. You've got 3 boys. I think it's just one of them was with us at the time. I remember being really struck by Stephen, actually, Danielle, because as I shared, we were just around the table and he sort of wept at some of the stories I shared. So I obviously had a really soft heart. But I love what you carry. I love what you share. I think we've got very different life stories, but there's a lot of similarity in terms of, even down to the fact that you were 20 plus years with the Salvation Army, and I worked in the red light district with the Salvation Army for a bit in Hamburg on the Reeperbahn, and working with Your Heart for the Poor. I've been working in the hungriest, poorest country in the world, Burundi, and you talk a lot about comfort. I want to come to that, and the curse of comfort, I would say, how destructive that is for our souls, potentially, how we need to watch out. Anyway, I'm already starting to talk. I don't want to do much of the talking. I want to set you up to hear the gold of Danielle Strickland. And straight away, well, let's just go to your childhood. And your childhood story is a real encouragement to me. So it wasn't straightforward, was it?
No, everybody's a complex bundle of things. And I think it's, especially as speakers, it's really hard because you're trying to take complexity and make it simple. So oftentimes I've taken my story and tried to simplify it. And I think in some circles of faith, what that means is we present this sort of magical, sort of almost superstitious idea of ta-da, like a Cinderella story. And in some ways there is this moment of awakening, but it's a pretty messy, it's a messy, broken story. I mean, that's the story of God moving through history, right? Is coming into our broken, messy stuff and introducing us to some options, to some other ways. So for me, my story begins with my parents were pastors in the Salvation Army. So both of them redeemed by, rescued. They were both orphans, both foster care. My dad was sold illegally as a baby. Both of them found by people knocking on doors in poor neighborhoods saying, are there any kids who want to come with us, And my mom describes it, she's 10. She runs to the front door, as this person's knocking just to get out of that home. It was toxic, abusive, all the things. And she said the first time she went to church there, it was the first time she ever felt wanted anywhere. And so that's kind of her intro, which is this beautiful, glorious story. Again, it's just yay. And then I'm born into that family. The trouble is that, a lot of those cycles of violence or trauma get repeated. And then, when they were rescued, they were redeemed. I mean, they have these beautiful stories of rescue and did so much better, than where they were. But at the same time, there's these repeated traumas. There's all this kind of broken attachment issues. And so I grew up in that home with a large expectation of sort of spiritual conformity. So I would have understood to follow God means to sacrifice. It means to behave properly all the time. It means to submit to this kind of extreme version of don't touch, don't see, don't do all these things. And I just naturally as a kid, I know now I'm an Enneagram 7 and I probably had ADHD. So I just didn't conform well at all, ever, or obey easily at all, ever, And then also there was some toxic abuse. There was abuse in my history. There's sexual abuse within church leadership in my background, which I had not even acknowledged until, just like 10 years ago or something.
Wow.
Or didn't even know, didn't remember. But there's all this kind of brokenness and pain and abuse. And then this like construct of like obedience and conformity and like, I've got to fit in and I never fit in, And so for me, the only way out was like complete rebellion. Like I'm all the way out of here. Like I can't. And then of course I know now I was drug addicted. Drugs were like, I think self-medicating for me, then just would have been wild and a way out, just a ticket out of my overactive brain, of my inability to fit in, And so that led all the way down. And I think I just ultimately believed that rebellion was freedom. I think that's the lie, and that Christianity or faith or the church was slavery, So this is complete upside down. Although sometimes, depending on how you do a church, it can literally be this invitation to slavery. So I went all the way down that road, and really just like trauma and brokenness and more of it and more of it, more estrangement. My dad and I specifically, he's pretty authoritative, tough love kind of guy. None of that worked on me. Just drove me further and further away. But there was a moment when I was in jail, finally sort of crossed a line where I didn't know if I could get back over. It was just all the way. I was in a holding cell. I was being remanded. And because I used to get out of jail free all the time because my parents are with the Salvation Army. So they would like come in with their super suit, I call it, their uniform, and then like vouch for me and they'd get me out. So I was always sort of playing that card as much as I could to get out of trouble. But here I was stuck. And one of their friends, who was like a really high-ranking Salvation Army officer at the headquarters, came, I guess, on her lunch break and just came in to see me in this holding cell. I don't even know how she got in, because you're not really supposed to get in. But she got in. I remember she handed me a lawyer's card, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered in my ear, "I love you," which sounds all like, Hallmarky. It sounds like a nice movie, although I was not interested in her coming. I didn't want her to come. I was not responsive to her coming. I didn't hug her back. I was just like, the whole thing was embarrassing to me. I remember her leaving and me shouting out after her, you didn't even bring me a smoke. What's the point? So not grateful, just totally darkened and hard. And when she left, the door shut, I remember, and I was alone in this holding cell down in the basement of the Toronto City Hall. And then Jesus showed up. And this is the part of the story that's really hard for people to understand. It's hard for me to even describe, but Jesus did the same thing. I felt, heard, saw Jesus come, wrap his arms around me and whisper in my ear, "I love you." And something happened, Simon, something supernatural. There's different ways of knowing, right? One is with our head. We can go through our head. And one is with our heart. It's like the eyes of my heart opened. The darkness began to lift. And literally I said, and I don't know what your, rating is on this podcast, so I might have to edit.
Go for it.
But I literally said, "I'm in jail." Like I came to myself, like I saw for the first time, because up until that time, I remember like, this isn't bad. This is not a bad, thing on my rebellion record. Like I'm killing it on the rebel side of things, But then I literally had this moment where I saw, one, God is different than I thought. And two, that the love can't stop anything. Like you can't stop love. This is a literal message of the Gospels. You can't even kill God. God refuses to die. That's how powerful love is. So that love just awakened, turned a light on in me. And then what would have been a glorious movie moment is for me to fall on my knees and give my life to God. Sort of that Les Miserables moment of like, I'm the monster and like all that stuff. But I literally just had this light, like I shouldn't live this way anymore, but I still felt very undeserving. And so I really resisted. And what I actually did, which is a very religious impulse, and people do this to this day, is I thought, I know, now I better clean up my life to be good enough for God. Even though God had clearly come before I cleaned anything up. But anyway, so then I did a bunch of relapses and, a bunch of like off the rails sort of stuff until finally, I relented and said, I can't clean up my life. God, I've tried. I'm actually quite bad at getting good.
Yeah.
And surrendered to the grace and the goodness of God. I often call that season of my life, trying to take a shower without any water. And I'm sure, Brenda, you've had opportunities to try, it just hurts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't work very well.
Yeah. So what sort of age are you then?
So I was 17, just before my 18th birthday, in jail, which in Canada is quite a gift because I wasn't tried as an adult, which
Right.
which does leave some options on the table for later.
And so I remember reading about you, as a delinquent being allowed to go on a mission trip. So I mean, that's extraordinary, and how God really worked in that.
Yeah, I had to get special permission from my probation officer to go to Malawi, Africa, with an organization that just like let teenagers do mission trips and those sort of old-fashioned ideas that we could help people with our amazing teenager skills.
Yeah.
We now know that really that mission trip is about training, right? It's about an invitation to see the world differently and maybe to get yourself out of the center of even your salvation story, which is what happened for me. So I went on that mission trip and I literally was like a delinquent. Simon, I was not good at conforming. And I managed to find it's an interdenominational group that is more rule bound than the Salvation Army. I was like, I didn't know that this was possible, but I found it. And so I had this struggle. I mean, I think they had several meetings, the leadership team, about whether they're going to send me home or not. I mean, it was hard and for all of us. And every day, if you didn't do what you were told, and I mean, quite literally, they would ring a bell and that was like, read your Bible time. And if you weren't reading your Bible after they rang that bell, you got what was called a special blessing. And a special blessing was that you got to work on your free time.
Right.
So they called me, I was especially blessed all summer long is how I put it.
Yes, I'm sure.
I was the SB queen. But in the midst of that, I had this encounter with this woman named Fatima, a young girl. And we had this assignment. I had this one day on my mission trip where I could possibly get some free time. It was literally one day the whole summer long. And I didn't want to give it up. And we had this assignment that we had to tell somebody about Jesus. And they gave us this like tract, this old fashioned tract. And I was like, oh my, this is ridiculous. Like and it was like after like we had to do this mime thing. I was just like embarrassing and I'm just like, I can't. And then I'm like, I need this free time, so literally motivated by the hope of getting like 2 hours off for the summer. I found this girl named Fatima and said, I call it the world's worst gospel presentation. Because I was like, Fatima, if I don't talk to somebody, I'm going to get in trouble. Would you mind? And she's like, okay, fine. And so I taught, I did the 4 things, if God loves you, you've sinned, bummer, Jesus died, woohoo. Would you like to, and she's like, yeah, I think I would. And I'm like, I don't think you understood it. And I did it again. And she said, yes, I would. And then I did it again. And this time I acted out everything. And I just, in the end, I let her, give her life to Jesus, which I thought was kind of me. But the next day when I was praying, because I had this other revelation, like I had this other opening where I realized that I believed God could save anyone because God saved me. What I didn't believe that would change the rest of my life is that God could use me to help save somebody.
Yeah. That
revelation changed literally the trajectory of my life and opened me to a salvation that is boundless and an invitation that salvation's not just something you're saved from. You're not just saved from something, you're saved for something.
Yes.
And that saved for something, that began to awaken in me all those things I thought were rebellious identities or badness were actually laden gifts of risk and laden gifts of curiosity and discovery and the willingness to go outside of the bounds of where people have put boxes before. All of those things were laden in me. And so that discovery, was just the beginning of like a life of pursuing, how can I serve? How can I help? How can I get myself out of the center? How do I participate with God in creating this beautiful new world and inviting people to experience what I did?
Yes, love that. And I love that God takes hold of us with our personalities, doesn't he? So you and I but clearly don't have the compliant genes. And similarly, my kids haven't got compliant gene pools. So, but it's good that some people are compliant, but it's good that some people aren't compliant. And if you're not compliant, you're probably going to end up doing something potentially spectacular if the energy is harnessed in the right direction, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing is this, what the enemy likes to do, or what darkness likes to do is, first of all, darken your understanding to start you cursing the way you're made. And that's been a big piece to me in my own discovery. Like, and this has been years and years, but I remember actually having this aha moment of like the way that God sees you is through a lens of total goodness. Like your purest self, like when you were created good. Before anything else, before there was brokenness, before there's any sin, before there's any pain, there's goodness. That's the first word over your life. I used to this happened to me. I would tuck my son in, Moses, my youngest. He's like a delightful little kid. And we had this little routine. I'd say, Moses, who made you? And he would look at me and he'd say, God made me. And I'd say, that's right, honey. And how did he make you? And he'd look at me and goes, he made me good. And I'd be like, he sure did. He made you good. He made you fearfully, wonderfully, all these things. And then I would close the door. And this one time I closed the door and I like heard a voice from heaven kind of thing. I heard God say to me, Danielle, who made you? And I said, you made me. And he said, how did I make you? And I just like squeaked out these words, you made me good. You made me good. And I realized that I had actually not believed that for my whole life. I had not believed that. I believed that I was bad and that God was, God rescued me from badness. I didn't really understand that I was actually good first. That goodness is the first word and the last word, that grace and love and the forming. So I think that identity piece in everybody's life is so key. God made you good. And when he looks at you, it's like when parents look at their newborn kid, it's like full of like, you can't even describe. I've seen, one of my favorite moments is this guy that was like just this violent, horrible criminal guy that like beat up my friend. My friend has struggled through sexual exploitation and boyfriend after boyfriend who was abusive, these patterns and cycles of abuse. And she was having a baby and there was this big incident. She almost lost it because this guy was violent and he was arrested. And I was like, yay, he's been arrested, And I went to the hospital to welcome this little baby to the world that was born. And I saw this prison guard outside. And I was like, what are you doing here? And he's like, well, the father got permission to see the baby. So he's here on a prison visit, and I was like, what? I was outraged. I couldn't believe it. And I was like, who allowed this? And the guard said, I think the mother requested it. And I was like, just so frustrated by these cycles of like violence and all these things. And I'd made this guy out to be the enemy, of course, because that's what it sure looks like. And when I got inside the room, she was sleeping and the crib was empty. And I was like I'm like, where's the baby? And I could hear these noises around the corner. So I go around the corner and I see this prison garbed guy, he's still in his jumper and he's weeping. He's just like crouched up against the wall and he's got, and he's just weeping. He's weeping. He looks at me, he's holding his baby and he looks up at me and he just says through these, tears, have you ever seen anything so beautiful? And what is it that he's seeing? What is it that he's seeing? And then instantly in that room, I remember seeing him through the eyes of God. And what I realized is that God saw him the same way he saw his child.
Yeah.
He saw all the way through the disguises and the pain and the trauma and the sin, the stuff he'd done and the stuff that had been done to him. He saw all the way through to that longing. That guy holding that little baby, he's that baby in desperate need of somebody to see him like that and to know him like that and to love him like that. And God was like, that's how I see everybody, the way I made them.
Yeah.
And it's that, if you could get that gaze, and I guess that's what I saw, in that jail cell all those years ago, was Jesus showing me that's how he saw me. Longing for me the way that a father longs for a child or a mother longs for their kid, And I remember all those years ago, I was in this in-between stage. So I had this revelation. I wanted to do better, but I still had all this baggage. I still smoked and I still was relapsing occasionally. I still was I was on probation, so I had to be in at 10. I had no friends. So I lived in this in-between world and it was really hard because I was really lonely. And I remember like I'm home at 10 with my parents, like I'm like, what am I doing? Like, is this my life? Is this my life now? And I remember one night was particularly bad. So I took off up this famous street in Toronto called Yonge Street, and I knew where to score. I was just going to go take the edge off. And I knew that I shouldn't, like I had, but I just didn't know what else to do. And I had no one to hang out with. And I just felt so alone. And I remember I was going up on my way, and there was this little chapel, this little church that was having a service. And it was the Salvation Army. That back in the old days, they had these night meetings. It was just this. And I slipped in and I sat at the back. It was halfway through the service. And halfway through the service, the guy that was leading the service stopped it and said, we're actually just going to have a time of open sharing. We call it a testimony time. And anyone that just has anything to say can just stand up and say it. I'm sitting at the back. This halfway to the front, there's this blind retired minister lady. And she gets up and she says, actually, I would really like to request some prayer for a young woman who I heard about recently, has given her life to God, and her name's Danielle. And I wonder if all of us, I promised her mother I would pray for her. I wonder if all of us could just stop right now and pray for her. And she's blind.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in the back row, like in this struggle, in this real life struggle of like, what am I going to, I don't know how to. So obviously, like they prayed. I was like, what is happening right now? Slipped back out, walked back home, and said, okay, lonely it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that relentless pursuit of a God who knows, who sees, to say you're not alone. You're not alone. And there is a purpose that's greater, even when you can't get it or feel it. And from the day to day, you're just sort of stuck. That God is working, always trying relentlessly to say, you are not alone. You are loved. You are good. You are known. You're enough. I gotcha.
And I know that you said it wasn't straightforward at all, and it wasn't a plain sailing way to salvation and discipleship. But your parents were in that meeting, weren't they? When you sort of prayed the prayer, as it were. And that, I mean, I just imagine being them, listening to that happening, just being a very powerful moment.
Yeah, it was complicated because there was so much brokenness between my dad and I.
Sure.
One of the most powerful things that happened actually was when I finally relented. So like I kind of had this encounter with Jesus, and then I was like going to clean up my life, and then I kept failing, all these things. And I remember I was at a Sunday night meeting one time, and I did finally, in our tradition, you go forward for prayer. It's called the mercy seat. Just who doesn't need that? But and so I went to the mercy seat and I made this public confession, like I can't do this anymore, God. Like you're going to have to take my life. And I did hear somebody weeping behind me. And when I had, sort of done my prayer and just offering to God, when I looked behind me, it was my dad. And my dad, between his, weeping, he just would say to me, please forgive me. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I'm so sorry. And when he tells the story, which he does because he's a preacher, he talks about it being his conversion into the mercy of God. Like his conversion of like, I didn't get it right either. Like I participated in my own sin and brokenness and trauma and pride and ego. So he talks about how we were kind of converted together in a way. And of course, you can't undo some of those things so quickly, but there is the Spirit of God awakening all of us, right? No matter what our positions are, or no matter what direction we come from, to say, there's another way. There's another way. Maybe it doesn't have to be so hard and broken and ego-driven and controlling, and someone has to be right and someone has to be wrong. Like maybe there's another way, and maybe it's love, and maybe it's grace, and maybe it's tenderness, and maybe it's mercy, and maybe we walk together in brokenness and say God has to lead us together. So that began what has been a very long journey of reconciliation, really, and some healing in that relationship.
Hi, folks. I hope 2024 has got off to a good start. I think most of you know this podcast comes out on the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach, working in Burundi, which is still annoyingly the hungriest and poorest country in the world. And there are so many positives. I mean, I look back at last year, see that we've impacted a couple of 100,000 people in a very meaningful way. I've got all these lovely photos of prostitutes that we've helped get out of prostitution, giving them a new skill as tailors. I think of street kids that we've helped get off the streets. Think of microfinance loans that we've given out to the poorest of the poor people, mainly widows who have managed to start up businesses and are now thriving, being lifted out of poverty. Mud huts that we've been able to knock down and build sort of brick houses with a tin roof and a door that can be locked to actually protect these vulnerable ladies. So many people have come into relationship with Jesus, come to faith. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. In that context, at the same time, there have been 40% food price rises of basic foodstuffs, and there have been 5 hikes in the last 3 months of fuel, which just adds up to crippling inflation that affects everybody. It's so challenging. So if you want to back us, if you're enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it, you sowing into the work. And that's so you can go do that at greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. We'd love it for you to journey with us. greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. And keep enjoying the podcast. Now let's get back to it. The Salvation Army, obviously a massive part of your DNA. People like to make fun of the Salvation Army. They also love the Salvation Army because they give out food and they're kind and they've got their funny antiquated uniforms, that sort of stuff. I love the Salvation Army. My experience with them on the streets of the Reeperbahn in Hamburg, they were so hardcore and so committed, and we got our hands dirty. We did street evangelism, like demons manifesting. I mean, it was being punched and spat at and hit, and I just look back with such fondness at their totally unashamed faith. So give a sort of flavor. What do you appreciate about your background?
Well, I think this DNA, I tell people, like in Canada where I'm from, everybody has a favorite hockey team. It'd probably be like a soccer or football thing for the UK folks. So in my house, we never had a favorite team. What I would do is on hockey night in Canada, I would go in and I'd say, Dad, who are we rooting for? And my dad would say, well, the Underdogs are, and so our team was the Underdogs. No matter what the match was, we were on the Underdogs team.
Love that.
And that DNA, that is kingdom. That is the kingdom of God. God is always on the side of the underdog. That's just who he is. And so that, that DNA shaped. So people say, like, how did you get into social justice? Like, how did you begin to actually move? And I'm like, well, I'm on the side of the underdog. And I grew up when I was, 7 years old knowing that. And that really shapes you, doesn't it? It really shapes you. And there's a DNA in that, in the Salvation Army's best sort of DNA, which is this like Isaiah 58 idea of true worship. Or, if you get to James, it's like, what is the religion that is any good at all? Is it not the religion that cares for the widow and cares for the orphan and demonstrates what I call like the demonstration of the proclamation of good news? What does the good news look like? And if you're looking for what the good news looks like, it looks like God on the side of the underdog, raging against the darkness, So that DNA is deeply, deeply embedded in me. And even through the complicated nature of like systems and structures, I'm no longer serving as an officer in the Salvation Army. That inclination I have to go outside the lines is like real. Those lines sometimes are even within movements that have such glorious histories. But that DNA, that's not going anywhere. That's all the way through me.
Yeah. So in terms of chronology, you're this raw, rough diamond. Did you I need to go to Bible college, or what was the next steps?
So this is the other thing that traditionally has been super cool about the Salvation Army. I don't know. I think they might be losing this in some ways, but some of their origin and way back when this was happening for me is there's a really quick process from saved, from like rescued to like serving. That's one of the great, that was, in the origin story, William Catherine Booth, that was one of their great, you get them saved and you keep them saved and you go get them to get somebody else saved. And this process was really quick. In those days, it was like you go from like an alcoholic on the street to like 9 months later, leading the charge to help other people out of alcoholism. Now, you can see inherent dangers in that as well, and those are all true. But like that idea of like, and especially one of the other things that I love about the heritage and DNA of the Salvation Army that's true in my life is that they're fiercely egalitarian. So women are not considered like, well, I guess we'll have to use them because we need them. It was no, these are part of God's design to see women lead. So to go through the Salvation Army training program was 2 years. Took me 3 because I dropped out for 1, but anyway. But it's like a combination of Bible training, so you do work towards a degree, an undergrad, but at the same time you're being trained in ministry, and then you're just like sent out to lead at a local. And I was sent nowhere, which is great. Literally nowhere. I was like, 14 hours away from the nearest Salvation Army headquarters. I mean, you can't, in the middle of a small town in like northern British Columbia, like nowhere Canada. And you kind of just got to figure it out. How am I going to lead? And that's what happened, which of course it is a situation that I can thrive in. Because I can try stuff, and I can experiment with stuff. And God was really gracious, and we just had a really fun time trying a bunch of things.
Go and give us your favorite sort of stories from those times.
Okay, well, I'll say one of the first things we did is there was a standoff that First Nations people of Canada have been, totally obliterated and oppressed by the government and the churches, really, in the history of Canada. So this has always been a bit broken and politically charged, So this is me. I'm like fresh out of training college. I get to my new town in the middle of nowhere, British Columbia, where they've sent me probably to just keep everybody safe. And there's a standoff that's happening between this native tribe and this RCMP. They're blocking a road for an oiling company or something like that. And so I'm just like, this is perfect. Like, get the soup, like we got to feed these people, like they're so we get all the soup stuff and we get all these donated things, and we take this van, and I'm literally like we're just got a map out, and like the military, like people are passing us with like, camouflage faces with like military. We're just like, like this is serious. And we get there, we're just like, we're here to feed the people. We're the Salvation Army, this is what we do. And they're like, what are you doing? You can't be here. And I was like, no, someone's got to be here to care for the people. And we've arrived, And so anyway, they wouldn't let us through. So we ended up feeding the RCMP, unfortunately, like in some ways, because I was trying to get to the standoff people. But anyway, then we made a prayer circle and we prayed for people. And ideally I'm like, what am I? I'm like maybe 23. And we're praying for these. Often we're praying for peace, we're praying for mercy, we're praying that God would give us an understanding that these are humans that God loves, like all these things, and we're giving soup and donuts out. And anyway, we're driving back. We had a really great time. We're just like, this has been amazing, I'm completely unaware of the larger political climate. And then, of course, on the national radio, it's like this convoy of Salvation Army supporters came out to feed, and it was just this big. And I remember like all the phones blowing up and our bosses calling us. And I just remember them going like we sent you nowhere,
And you're still headlining.
And it's still, and I think just from that, that was just literally the first week. That's what happened. And then from there, we just really saw God do some really remarkable things in people's lives, churches coming together to pray for the city. We started to pray that God would help us really be a positive impact in the city that was just struggling with alcohol and drugs and, lots of Indigenous kids that were just like stuck in these cycles of oppression that were coming into town. It had the highest carjacking rate in all of Canada, which is like this tiny little town nowhere had this highest. Anyway, we just came together and just saw God do some beautiful things. And it was a beautiful time to just play in some ways with God and see God do things through people that really he just has no business using, which is, of course, the great reversal. This is God's great business, isn't it? Let's find the people who are the most unlikely, folks who have the least amount of power to change anything. And let's move through them. That will demonstrate that God is who God is.
Yeah. And you needed a special person to do life with, to journey with. Stephen's obviously a really special guy to complement you. What does that look like?
Yeah, so Steve, sometimes I wonder if he's human or if he's like part like machine man, robot man. He is like the most solid person you will ever meet. As a matter of fact, he's unmovable when he's made his mind up, which can be the most furious thing as a wife, and can also, is one of the most glorious things as a man of faith, So his his rituals, his rhythms, his disciplines are rock solid. And Stephen is relentless. Like, he has a forehead of flint. So he cannot be moved. When God tells him to do something, like, good luck. He can't be threatened. He can't be cajoled. He can't be punished. Like, there's nothing that will stop this man from doing what it is that God told him to do. So that's, the steadiness of that, daily. I remember when I married him, I remember thinking to myself, and this is like tragic, and I know a lot of people think this, but I remember thinking, like, this guy presents himself as so like righteous and holy. I'll see the real guy, and I think I said that to some friends, like, I'll see the real guy, which is just like, how broken is that? But anyway, and I remember, like, after a year going, like, is he really this guy? Like, is this true? Like, I can't believe this guy is like this. And then about 2 years and 3 years and 4 years, just going, like, I think he might really be righteous and holy. Like, I didn't know that. I thought there was like a hidden guy somewhere, and there's no hidden guy. He's just righteous and holy. And so,
beautiful,
and just totally different made than I am. Even politically, we have different leanings. We're just made so different. Some people, if you know us both well, will say, how do you guys do it? And I'll be like, this is love, this is what love looks like. And actually, it's been a great way of, as I understand that love can cover and can present a way, even when you don't totally agree on all the things, but the way that you live, if it's loving, is the way forward. It's been a great learning curve for me, for all other people that I work with and organizations that I might work with, where we don't have to agree on all the things if we can agree that love is the way forward.
Yeah.
And I always say, my husband thinks conservatively, like theologically, but he leans in mission left. He leans liberally in the mission department, which I can live with that.
Yeah. Brilliant. A few weeks ago, we had Sam Ward on the podcast, who I know you know from Manchester, and he talked about moving in to this horrific open shore estate with a brothel on one side and a heroin addict. I'm trying to remember the detail. Just two classically broken scenarios on either side. You've lived in that kind of context as well. Stephen's been up for that. You've had different incarnations of that. Just tell us about some of those contexts you've worked in.
For me, a large part of that calling for both of us really was, I think, to understand that God is on the side of the underdog, and that if you wanted to join God, you needed to join him in that work. Like, this is the invitation God gives, is this what I would call descension, not ascension. And there are these moments, I think, in our Christian lives where there are these invitations to join God on the side, And so I think that was our desire to do that. And then I think that was our working in that community saved us from, I think, of a white saviorism context, because we really believed, I think probably deep down, that we were coming to show these people Jesus. And I think in some ways we were, because Jesus is on the side. Jesus moves in. Jesus comes close. Jesus isn't scared of the dark. Jesus goes out of his way to get in the way of oppression and pain all the time. This is the pattern of heaven. But what we did discover there is that Jesus is there already. And Jesus's followers, and some of the people with the greatest amount of faith I've ever met in my life, don't look how I thought they'd look. They're often wearing these disturbing disguises of pain and poverty. And, I remember one of my favorite characters that I met there, people, is named Annie, and she was drug addicted and mentally ill. So this dual diagnosis, which is kind of the problem in the community. It's like complex and difficult. Yeah. And ultimately, Vancouver as a city, which is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, which is why this is like also so weird, the paradoxical, but they just made a decision to try to prevent infectious diseases from spreading. And because 78% of the people in the downtown east side had HIV, and over 90 of them have Hep C. So they just were like, this is now an infectious disease problem. And so we're just going to do whatever we can to keep these diseases. So what they've done is created an actual containment. This is like part of their city health policy. And they made a containment area that basically just says you can use here freely. We don't care. We're not going to arrest you for drug use. We're not going to, but you can't leave here. And so it literally is this like contained area of pain and loathing. It's just is these people are going to die. I think they accept, we'll try to get them to die with dignity. So there's all these like safe injection sites and so I could get somebody a clean needle, some clean water, I could get them even sometimes some heroin. What I could never get them was detox or treatment or, ways out of this neighborhood. So again, it's just these like so many oppressive elements. But anyway, Annie was in the midst of that. So mentally ill, drug addicted, all the people you don't want in your neighborhood get driven to the downtown east side and they live there. That's how it works. And I remember she would just every now and then, like, she wasn't good at behaving. She was a little bit like me. She wouldn't stay in the containers, So there's all these stories with Annie just like breaking all the rules. But she would every now and then just end up in a mental hospital for breaking the rules kind of thing. And I went to visit her one time in a mental hospital. And I remember her seeing me, just going like, yeah, Danielle, and coming, giving me this big bear hug. And Annie's like, she's got these like Rasta black hair, just like crazy hair and these like wild eyes and like always like burnt out cigarette butts in her pocket. So it kind of smells rancid and her nails are like full of dirt, like just unkept, So you're like a little bit like you're kind of scared of her if you didn't know her. But if you knew her, you knew her to be like an amazing human. Anyway, she wraps her arms around me and she says, Danielle, you have got to see the craft room here. It's incredible. And I was like, okay, show me the craft room. She goes, yeah, of all the colors, and he's an artist, a musician. She speaks several languages, she's just trapped in these like oppressive cycles of mental illness and drug addiction. So she takes me to the art room and I'm thinking to myself, oh no, like, I hope I'm going to recognize her painting, like, I hope I'm going to be able to see what, and then I didn't have to worry because she had taken one of those like massive tablecloth, those like big paper rolls. And she had paper rolled the entire artboard covering everybody else's art up. And she had this big black marker and she had written in these block letters, what will you do with the king of Israel? This is Psalm 2, of course, right? If everyone's paying attention, it's Psalm 2. Annie comes from a Jewish background, so it's interesting. So I'm in this psych ward with Annie, and there's this question, what will you do with the king of Israel? This is Psalm 2 saying, like, why do the nations plot in vain against God? Like, do they not know that God sits in heaven and earth is his footstool, and he just laughs at their plans? Like, just this like big black bold letters. And then underneath, she had written in these little tiny red letters, kiss the sun. Kiss the sun. And in this craft room, in this mental hospital, with this drug addicted, mentally ill, literally like outlandish woman who is channeling, who is connected to these deep primal questions, who is like expressing them on this craft board, and I just felt like, God, like, this is the answer to the, what will you do with the king of Israel? Like, what about his judgment? What about his wrath? Like, what about like the injustice? What is the answer? The answer is intimacy. The answer is connection. The answer is relationship. The answer is kiss the sun, kiss the sun, kiss the sun, And I mean, how do you learn that? In Bible school. Yeah. How do you learn that in a suburban Bible study? You don't. You can't learn that. You can't learn that on that level, and then really like the ramifications of that have just been working themselves out of my life since then. Like, there are these formidable, so she was probably one of my best teachers. One time I went to Gastown, which is like this really beautiful, high-end, quaint neighborhood that's right on the corner, that sits up against downtown East Side. So you can imagine this is very dangerous, terrible things, because you have all these like drug-addicted people who are begging for money in this like really highfalutin sort of tourist attraction for Vancouver. So the Gastown business community hired their own security force to keep people out. So what they do is they basically, there's already a rule saying you're not supposed to be here, but if you do come here, we're gonna make sure you don't stay here. And so every now and then I would sneak over to Gastown to like start my day with a latte. And there's like a lot of judgment there, but I had to make some choices, and this was one of my choices. And I was walking there and I saw my way as I crossed the boundary, the border, which you can feel even in the spirit. You can move from one neighborhood to the other just over just one intersection. And when I crossed over, I saw Annie in Gastown busking, like trying to play the guitar for money. And we both saw each other. We were both sort of a bit embarrassed. Like we were both like, hi, I didn't expect to see you here. And Annie said, I didn't expect to see you here either, you know? And so I sat down with her and tried to busk for a while, you know, like which is a fascinating perspective. We were making zero money. And I said to her, you know, why don't you just come with me? I'll buy you a latte. I'm going to Starbucks, you know? And Annie goes, I thought you'd never ask. You know, so we're getting the guitar together, and I ended up packing up this guitar and stuff, and we see this guy being escorted out by the security, and he's irate, he's drunk, he's like mad, he's spinning everywhere, you know, he's just like shouting, and these two security guards are on either side of him, and they're just like, you're leaving this neighborhood, you're not allowed here, you know, and they're coming down, and Annie sees this happening, and I watch her, it's like goes to slow-mo in my mind, because I watch her see it, and she just goes directly towards the commotion, you know, this is,
yeah.
And I'm like, no, like I was going to just take you for a latte, like I wanted an easy morning, like this is not what I signed up for, you know, like this is, and I'm watching her, and she just goes straight towards this guy, I'm like running after her, and she grabs him, you know, by the scruff of the neck, and then she just kisses him. Like full on open mouth, like unhygienic. Like I literally never wanted a toothbrush more in my whole life as I watched this unhygienic, full on, you know, intimate moment. She just kisses this guy. The security guards literally just take steps back because they're like, we don't want to be anywhere near what's happened. Like, we don't know what to do. What are we going to arrest them for love, you know? So they're kissing. I'm there. The security guards are looking at me. I'm like, I don't know what to do. You know, I don't know I just wanted a latte. You know? And she finally stops and she looks at this guy and she just says, I really love you. And this guy says, I love you too, man. And then he's totally different. He's calm. He's in his right mind. The signs of drunkenness are gone. Literally, he's just totally. And then now nobody knows what to do again. We're all just still standing around looking at these guys because we don't know what to do. And Annie breaks the silence and she looks at him and she goes, Dave, I got some good news. And Dave's what? And Annie goes, Danielle's taking us to Starbucks. And Dave and Annie and I, the security guards were like, okay, bye-bye. You know, we got to get out of here because we don't know what to do. And we all just walked up the opposite direction, you know, in the direction of the tranquil, beautiful morning I had planned, and we all had a beautiful latte together. And again, Annie teaching me, what do we do with injustice? Like, what do we do with pain? What do we do with marginalization? What do we do with this like abject, oppressive rejection of a people? You know, it's intimacy, it's relationship. We kiss, you know, we go towards it, you know, we go to welcome, we go to embrace. Anyway, so I just, you know, I'm still working out the theology that I learned from Annie in those places. And not just her, many, many others, but just how God is at work all the time in those places, showing me, teaching me through very unlikely people, the deep, deep ways of the kingdom of God.
Yeah. You almost just want to sit in that and process it, you know, in silence. Now, loads of your work has involved, you know, if you're on the side of the outsider and the downcast and those that take advantage of the most marginalised. I mean, that is ladies in the sex, you know, sexually trafficked and prostitutes, brothels. Can you share a bit on that?
Yeah, I feel like I could share all day on that one because I've been a brothel chaplain, I guess, in many different countries. But I don't know which story to tell you, but let me tell you a story that links sort of Salvation Army land with the sexual exploitation. So this is one of the DNAs of the Salvation Army. One of its earliest movements was against childhood prostitution or against human trafficking. So it's like early 1900s. This is one of Booth's. So all the entire early movement of the Salvation Army was dedicated in stopping the evil of prostitution, is what they would say. And Catherine Booth, who's the co-founder of the Salvation Army, she was one of the first people to say that prostitutes are people who are sinned against, not who are sinning. So she understood the nature of this like oppression that was then put on the person as more oppression, you know? So she really understood that. So anyway, they have this history. And when the Salvation Army went to Japan, their earliest movements, they prayed and asked God, you know, what what are we doing here? And there was 50 Japanese Salvation Army people there at the time. And they said, oh, this is no brainer. God's raised up in the Salvation Army in Japan to shut down the brothel system where they're trafficking children. And what was happening in Japan, in Tokyo, was very similar to what's happening in Thailand, where there's this open system. And it's not really allowed, but like no one's stopping it. It's like every sort of the social understanding that like these very poor families who owe debts are selling their children, their girls, into this prostitution, this open prostitution, and that's somehow paying off the debt. Of course, we know that's just trafficking now, and they never really pay off the debt, and it ruins everybody's lives. But anyway, that's happening there. And so they decide they're going to shut this down. And I mean, it's the story is outlandish, but I got a hold of this story when I was in Australia as the social justice director, and I too was trying to shut down trafficking, and I didn't know how because there are these legalized brothels, and I just didn't really know what to do. And so I was like looking, praying, God, show me. And one of my mentors gave me this story of this old story of these brothel invasion. It's called the brothel invasion of Japan. And they just organized themselves. They had all night of prayer meeting. They printed 1 million magazines with the cover saying why girls should not be sold for sex, just like right on the cover. 1 million of these things. There's 50 of them. I mean, it's just insane. No one even knows who they are. And they organize themselves to these invasion Saturdays. So they call the press ahead of time and they say, we're going to invade the brothels. You might want to know about it. They make 1 million of these things, and then they pray all night. And then they take a big bass drum, boom, boom, boom. They march to the brothel and they give everybody copies of this magazine. They make a big circle, and then they make an announcement saying any girl that wants to come with us to get out of this, can come with us, come into the middle of the circle right now, and we'll take you to a safe place. And so they do this. And like the first time, 7 girls are like, are these people for real? And they come inside the circle, and the Salvation Army people circle them around them, which is one of my favorite images of holiness. This is what holiness is. And then they begin to exit, and the brothel owners are like, you can't take these people, you can't. And so they sick their like goons on them, and they start coming, they beat the Salvationists from the outside. They're just starting to, and as this is happening, of course, the media arrive on the off chance that these crazy people that said they were are invading the brothel, and start taking these pictures. And it makes it becomes, anyway, they end up rescuing the girls. The Salvation Army people, about 4, I think, are hospitalized at the end of that first invasion. But it makes the papers. And every Saturday, the Salvation Army keeps going back, and they keep getting beaten. And then they keep taking girls with them. And I think there were 72 girls they rescued that way over 3 months of every Saturday. And it's still not making a dent in the system. Do you know what I mean? It's still not, but it's just this like rugged, determined, an invasion's coming, So anyway, the papers can't keep up with the public demand, because all of a sudden we've taken this like social kind of open secret, but now we've made it like a frontal thing. Yeah. And Japanese culture especially really don't like losing face, like the honor and face keep, all that stuff's really important. So there was all this public pressure, and they decided within 3 months they had this emergency vote in Parliament, and they voted a law into being, an emergency law that said if you wanted to sign yourself out of the brothel, you could do so. And the next day, over 12,000 girls signed themselves out of the brothel. Yes. So I got a hold of this thing, and I was just like, come on, we're doing an invasion. And we happened to have a big Salvation Army conference at the Melbourne Convention Center. And I drove by it. I was on the committee, which God only knows how I got on that. But anyways, I was on the committee for this, like putting on this big Salvation Army commissioning, it's called. There's like 5,000 Salvation Army people. It's like I call it like a penguin committee. Because we're all black and white, we're all in these like old fashioned uniforms, and no one's really dancing, but we're singing really good. So, on the Melbourne Convention sign, it says, Salvos, that's what we're called there, Salvos gathering. And then underneath on the same weekend, it said Sexpo, Australia's largest, Australasian sex show. So I go to the committee and I say, okay, guys, like, what are we going to do about the Sexpo? At the same weekend of our Salvos gathering, and they were like, well, we found out about that, we called, and the general manager assured us that all the Sexpo people will use entrance A and all the Salvo people will use entrance C. So we should be good. And of course, I was like, oh, good, because I was thinking I might go to a Salvation Army event and actually run into a sinner, That's not what I was asking. Like what I was saying is, what are we going to do, right? Like, because in my mind, I'm like, we're going to do an invasion. That's what we're going to do. So they said, well, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, I have some ideas. Leave it with me. So I call the general manager of the Sexpo and I say, I'm from the Salvation Army. I'd like to have a booth at your show and I'd like to kind of shut it down. Like I really think that the sex industry is like an evil against women and girls. And like, we need to shut it. Like, I'm trying to get the guy to reject me so that I can stage an invasion. Because that's what I want to get, the drums, all night of prayer, an invasion in this expo, and I want to reenact history, And this guy says to me, you're from the Salvation Army and you want a booth at my show? And I was like, yeah, because like I want to shut it down. And, and he's like, I am so honored right now. This guy says to me, I am so honored that you would want to come to my show. And I said, yeah, but I told you, like, I want to shut down your show. Like, and he goes, oh yeah, I get that. But he said, I'm so honored. I'll just fax through a floor plan and it would be an honor. Like, we would host you for free. Pick any booth you want. It would be an absolute honor to have the Salvation Army at our sex show. And I'm like, no. I don't think you understand. I'm going to give people Bibles. I'm going to tell people about the evils of the sex industry. Like, I'm going to, and he goes, yeah, I get it. I get who you are. Like, I can't believe you'd come. Like, I'm so, and I'm like, so now I'm like, what am I going to do? Like, now I have to go to a booth. Like, I have a booth at the sex show. So anyway, that's what we do is we set up a booth and it's got all these, like a prophetic prayer booth, and we're praying for people and we're giving out Bibles and we're giving out this book about the evils of the sex industry and like exposing sort of how this is a trap. And there's a lineup, and I thought, I don't want to expose people to the darkness of the sex. It's a really dark, because prostitution in Australia is legalized. So it's got like live porn shows. I mean, it's like the darkest thing I've ever been to. And I thought, who can I get to do this booth without hurting them, like without harming their. And so I thought, I know, I'm going to get every old retired lady, like Salvation Army grandma, I'm going to get them. So I call up the retired Salvation Army folks and I say, I need every female Salvation Army officer to come help me invade this sex show, And all of them are like, I'm in. Like, their DNA is wired for this, they haven't done it for a while, but they're just like, we're in. So I get to and they're manning this booth. There's lineups, they're praying for people. I mean, it's just unbelievable, actually. It's unbelievable, the way, the grace and the goodness and why are people at a sex show? They're hungry. They're hungry for intimacy and love and connection, and it's not even what they're going to get. But anyway, so that's what we're doing. And I come check on one of the retired officers, Marnie. Her name was Marnie. And I say, hey, how's it going? And she said, well, Danielle, this is amazing. These people are so hungry. God is so present. Like, it's such an honor to be here. And she said, but I hope everything's going to be okay. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, earlier a journalist came by with this lovely man named Greg, she said, and he was so open to prayer and he signed our Stop the Trafficking wall, and it was so, and she said, it wasn't until they took the picture when they were walking away that I realized Greg wasn't wearing any clothes. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure it'll be fine, So the next day, front of all the national papers, it's got a picture of this retired Salvation Army lady with this naked guy, Chippendale champion of the sex show, Greg. And it says the headline says, Salvos do Sexpo. And all the radios start calling and everyone starts calling about this, Salvos do Sexpo. Like, what are you doing at Sexpo? And then all the churches get mad at us. And then all my sex advocacy friends, that tried to stop trafficking get mad at me because I'm I'm like promoting the sex show. So, I mean, it's just I'm trapped in this nightmare in a way. But as I began, it was like the general manager of the sex show and I became these unlikely friends because we did a circuit together on all these radio shows. And in the end, actually, I was able to minister to him quite powerfully. And, he said to me, it's fascinating. He said, I've tried to actually give money before to organizations. Like, I've tried and no one will take my money. That's how filthy he is. That's how unwelcome he is. It's really interesting. And again, I'm not compassionate towards him because he's like the enemy, but anyway, we had this incredible relationship and went, we probably spoke to at least 1 million Australians to say, first of all, what people are really hungry for when they're hungry for sex is something sex can't provide, which is love, and love comes from God, and you can only get it through Jesus. And then also there is this evil oppression that's happening through the sex industry that is called human trafficking, and we're here to stop it. And it was one of the most powerful. Now, I know this is taking too long, I'm sorry, but 10 years later, I'm in Los Angeles at a church planning conference. I'm telling this story in the hope that maybe people who run churches might start understanding that your church exists for much more than just gathering a whole bunch of Christians to feel good about themselves. This missional impulse of God's work in the world. And I tell this story. And when I'm done preaching, the pastor comes to me and says, there's somebody over here you need to talk to. And I go down the stage, I'm talking to this woman can hardly keep it together. She's weeping, 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 weeping. And finally, when she gets it together, she says to me, I was the MC at that event, that sexpo. And I was outraged. She said, I was all the way in the sex industry. I was a star, as a porn star, whatever. And I was outraged that the general manager gave the Salvation Army an opportunity to have a booth. Like, there were so many of us that were so mad at him. And I was outraged. And she said, it was during that weekend, I got prayed for by one of your old ladies. Yeah. And she said, something awoke in me, a hunger for God. And I went back to my church. I had a powerful conversion experience. And God spoke to me there and said, I am calling you to be a bridge. I want to save the people trapped like you were. And I'm calling you to do it. And then she said to me, I didn't. I went to Bible school. I got married to a church planter. And I basically have just let him lead and done my thing. And she said, we were on holidays in Los Angeles and decided to just go to the church nearest our hotel. Wow. And you are the person. She's just I can't believe this is happening. She's just a mess on the floor. And she just said, God obviously wants to remind me of not just that I was saved from something, that I was saved for something, And so this is the work of God all the time, constantly awakening us not to do things again. That was the other thing that really, it's not like he wants to just keep repeating some sort of pattern. But he wants to invite us into a way of spending our lives for others, spending our lives in these otherworldly ways. It makes no sense on one level until afterwards. And then afterwards, you start to see the pieces. You start to see, this is God's plan of redemption. This is God's plan to say that everyone belongs and everyone matters. This is God's plan to go deeper than even the oppression and injustice, to say at the heart of that, there is a problem with reconciliation. There's people need to be found. People need to be found. So I've learned, to trust God, and those disruptions in our normal everyday lives are invitations to live differently and to trust and to build faith and to say, my life has got to mean something more than just my own ascension. That's just so boring. So tired, so colorless, but maybe self-transcendence, is possible. Maybe I could live for something greater than myself. And those are all the ways that we get to do that.
Yeah. Our time's running out, and I feel like we could do 10 of these. You're such a wonderful storyteller. I've got so many stories. I remember writing to you to get that Japanese story, because I found it so inspiring when I heard it, whenever it was, about 8 years ago. Hi folks, I'd love you to check out chooselife.org.uk, and there you can sign up for a weekly vlog that I'll be coming out with through the coming year. Journey with us. And also there you can buy the book if you haven't got it yet, Choose Life, 365 readings for radical disciples. So why don't you join us on that journey, chooselife.org.uk. Now let's get back to the podcast. Just before we close, a few more. I think about you talk often about comfort, and I just think it's such a danger. I am right now talking to you from a very nice middle upper class village just south of Bath, southwest England. I remember writing a blog once as Burundi. It kicked off 2015, burning barricades, the country going back 20 years in one go. I wasn't having a literal mental breakdown, but I was crying in a cafe, and I wrote a blog called The Curse of Comfort. I mean, lots of churning emotions at the time, and I was just thinking about that today before coming on with you, and I said there's a noble defiance in worshipping God in the midst of grim circumstances, and that's where the curse of comfort comes in. I write, I don't want to criticize Western Christianity, but as products of consumer cultures, we invariably end up conforming rather than being transformed in Romans 12 speak. We usually act as thermometers which reflect the reality of the environment rather than thermostats which set the very temperature and alter the whole environment. Thus, we often unwittingly craft ourselves a more comfortable consumer cross, and our whole worship experience can end up feeling shallow and anemic. And it's so easy, isn't it, to turn to comfort, be it Facebook, chocolate, TV, sex, rather than to Christ. And it's no wonder why my most intimate corporate West spiritual experience in the West have been with most obviously broken people. That's tramps, alcoholics, prisoners, who don't feel the need to maintain the facade that their lives are all in order. And God doesn't love us sophisticated people more than them, or them more than us, but what they do have over us is discomfort. They've been stripped of the mixed blessing or curse of comfort. And in their brokenness, stench, and unpolished desperation, God is extremely close. And I think that I want you just to talk a bit into the fact that you're not saying everyone has to move into the ghetto, but at some level, I challenge those of us that are living lives that are very comfortable. We need to move downward somehow, don't we?
Yeah, I think, it strikes me that Jesus helped us here where he said, in his manifesto, the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That the poverty of spirit is not like, the blessing is not optional and more because of poverty of spirit. The blessing is only attainable through poverty of spirit. And I think what happens with comfort is it disguises, so it's an illusion. So it's not that God doesn't want people to be comfortable. I think God wants the hungry to be fed. I think God wants those who are living in cycles of oppression to get out of it. I think redemption lift is a real beautiful blessing from God. So it's not that I want to romanticize poverty. Anyone who's lived anywhere near poverty hates it, right? We don't want it. I don't want to bless that on anybody. What I do want to say is that without a real genuine right sizing, without an honest humility, until you come to the end of yourself, you cannot find God. And that's what Jesus says. Like the kingdom of heaven, the way in is through poverty of spirit. And so it's until you can get to that poverty of spirit, like it's until you get to the end of yourself, which is why, like in 12-step recovery, this is why I figured it out. I can't do it. I'm at the end of myself. And the problem with comfort and wealth in general is it has all these illusions of I can. But then of course, the more you move into those spaces, the more you realize in the core of those places, there's an I can't. Everybody gets there. It's just a longer journey because you have this illusion of I can for so much longer. And actually, it's kind of a poverty in reverse. It's like a deep, deep poverty, comfort and wealth, because it keeps you from the kingdom of God until you get to the end of yourself. So it's just a really fascinating, to get there is the blessing. And that's why, when you're in a recovery circle, people will say, thank God. I ended up in a gutter, or like embarrassed at my work party, and I walked naked through my, thank God. You're just like, what? You can't thank God for that. That ruined your life. And they're like, it ruined my life and saved my life at the same time. And I was talking about, Matthew Perry was doing these interviews before he died untimely in his hot tub, the Friends star. And he said, I remember this one interview, and he just said, I don't know why no one will believe me, but I got everything I wanted, everything I ever thought I needed. And I was never lonelier. I was never more separated from myself. I was never more unhappy. I was never more, he's like, all these things are such illusions. Yeah. And I wish I could get people to believe me, he said in this interview. It's just such a delusion. And that's, so what's interesting is I used to tell people, flee the suburbs, flee it and come, this downward dissension. And recently, a couple of years ago during COVID, I had this awareness that that maybe actually there's a way to subvert our comfort and use it for others. So I started this thing called In My Backyard. It's really just a tiny little movement right now, but it's basically we're building tiny houses in people's backyards as a way of redefining family, as a way of pushing back against this autonomous, individualized, self-comforting life, which has, I think, shown everybody through COVID that it's super empty and not what we had hoped. and redefining sort of this idea of family. What does it mean to steward this life? So rather than just like, what if we used it, is basically what I'm saying. Like, what if the option was not like to give it up and to go do something else? What if the option is God saying, you're poor in spirit because the way that you're living in this way is not actually a reflection of me, but it's also not healthy for you either. This like autonomous, self-centered, and like this isn't working for anybody. Rates of anxiety, depression, they're all rising in these suburban places. Maybe there's another way to reimagine the world. And I think this is the great invitation of God, is like, what if what we had, again, was not for us? What if it's for something bigger than us? So we've been seeing these people, these beautiful people with these backyards, and say, like, what if we made room? What if we lived differently? What if we embraced? And this is this idea of, I think sometimes with these grand stories, we can give the notion that this life has to be this like full on abandonment of everything you've ever known. But actually, I think there's an invitation everywhere all the time that God is giving to say, there's a different way. There's a different way. There's a different way. And even like somebody with a home and a backyard who has all this capacity and all this room could make some room. And maybe the difference that they invite into their backyard makes a different kind of life. And it's uncomfortable and it's like different. And you have to like reevaluate your priorities and your spending, all these things. But actually, this is the invitation to model the kingdom of God. And so we've been seeing people begin to put their hand up to say, like, what if I did? And again, it's this like radical defiance of like, it's mine. It's the opposite of putting up a fence to say, don't enter this property. It's the opposite. It's like, very like middle class, upward middle class white communities saying to a Sudanese refugee, you can live with us, and live with us in such a way that you have your own dignity and your own autonomy and your own potential like way forward in terms of equity, but also live with us in the way that we're going to live differently now. And demonstrate like radical welcome and family in a world that's autonomous and individual. So for me, it's so funny because I came full circle. I left the suburbs, moved to the hood to kind of like in solidarity, and now back to the suburbs, but saying, is there a way that actually we could subvert the entire system? And this is the invitation. I think this reawakening that there are different ways of living everywhere, and that this discomfort is an invitation to move towards poverty of spirit, but also kingdom of God. And this is what the world's desperate to see. The kingdom. What does it look like? So this project, in a backyard, this young couple really making generous, funding it, building a community, building this tiny house to welcome this beautiful woman in to family, to community, and to belonging. And, everybody that's coming to work on this thing. So the guy that works for the city that had to dig the trench to put the plumbing in, he comes and he's asking, my friend Timo, who leads the project, he says, Timo, like, what's going on? And Timo's just telling him, well, we're in an affordable housing crisis, but also we're kind of lonely the way we've set up our lives. So we're deciding to live differently. And this is what we're doing, And this guy's like, wow, this is incredible. Yeah. Like, could I come back? Like, could you tell me when you're doing the next one and I'll just come for free? Like, you don't have to pay me next time. And then the guy putting on the roof is just like, what? Like, and you can feel the infectious nature of the kingdom of God. Like, this is what it's such good news, everybody. It's good news, not just for the people receiving, so-called these recipients, but these recipients are conduits of the Spirit of God to help us demonstrate a different way of life. And you can see it starting to spread, it's starting to spread. And, it's so beautiful, and this invitation's all the time everywhere. What if what you had was for something more than you? It not only would be helpful for the people who don't have what you have, it would be helpful for you. It would be a way of Maslow, by the way, at the end of his life, really regretted his hierarchy of needs. At the top of the Maslow hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. And at the end of his life, he talked to many of his friends, and everybody agreed that's not true. That he wished he had have had time. He died shortly after the conversation, but he wished he had had time to add another level, which is self-transcendence. Which is, of course, you hear the life of Jesus there, don't you? Like, everyone who's trying to keep their lives lose their life. But if you give your life, you'll gain your life. I mean, it's just this, it feels paradoxical, but even Maslow understood that self-actualization was not the top. But once you're self-actualized, there's something else. There's self-transcendence. It's how do you give your life to something greater than yourself? And that's when all the meaning, all the purpose, all the stuff that you were longing for actually gets to be actualized. And it's hard to convince people. Like Matthew Perry said, people don't believe it because we've been trained our whole lives at the top of the pyramid is self-actualization. If I get what I want, then I've made it. And then everyone who gets there is like, oh, this is not what I thought. So let's keep going. There's something higher than that, which is self-transcendence.
Oh, Danielle, I could listen to you all day, honestly. Look, is there anything that you really wanted to talk about or anything you want to point people towards before we call it a day that we haven't covered?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know if you were after the spider dream. Do you know about my spider dream?
No, go for it.
It was like I was actually pretty successful in the early days of ministry in terms of like metrics of growing a church from nothing, like from 7 to over 200, you know, in this small community, whatever. And I kept having this dream that I thought was demonic. In the dream, I walked through a doorway. The doorway was filled with all these spider webs that I didn't see. And when I walked through, I was bitten by this big, fat, hairy spider that I didn't know. And I got into the room. As soon as I got into the room, I got totally like crazy tired. And then like a bed appeared. And so I laid down on the bed. And as soon as I laid down on the bed, my whole body was paralyzed. I could not move. But I was still kind of awake, but I couldn't move my body. And then from the 4 corners of the room came these thousands of little tiny spiders. And they just consumed me. Now, I don't know a whole lot of like theology, but I know spiders are from the devil. That's like theology 101. So I prayed for it to go away. It kept waking me up every night, kept waking me up. I got like really, really like super expert and I started sleeping like with my Bible under my pillow. I'm like, the devil's trying to kill me at night, you know, all these things. I invited all these like super charismatic friends, you know, not the friends that I'm publicly friends with, but the ones that when I need some power, I call them, you know. And so they came over and did like a whole like sort of exorcism of this like demonic spirit of death, you know, whatever. And it didn't work. It kept coming back. So I called them back. And I remember we're in this circle and one of them says, have you asked God for interpretation for the dream? And I said, no, because I'm not an idiot. Like I die, like there's spiders. Like I know this is from the devil. They're like, I think you're supposed to ask God. So I'm like, okay, fine. So I asked God, is there an interpretation for this dream? And instantly I had it. And I felt like God said to me, you've walked through a cultural doorway and you've been bitten by a spirit of comfort. That spirit actually, he said a fat spirit of comfort. That spirit will lull you to sleep. It wants you to lie down. It'll exhaust you. And instantly I realized I was not exhausted for anything else. I was only exhausted when it was time to pray. I was only exhausted when it was time to serve. I was only exhausted when it was like the spiritual things that God was asking me to do. I had all night to party or all night to watch Netflix or all night, you know, I had all the time in the world, but this one thing was exhausting. And I felt like the Spirit said, if you give in to the Spirit, you will die. But you won't die gloriously. Like you won't be giving your life up for some beautiful thing. You'll die of 1,000 tiny little things that don't even matter. And I had all these, you know, like the color of the walls. I had all these, like the style of the worship. You know, I had all these like little tiny, like your wardrobe or like what people like, and you're just going to be consumed. I felt like God's like, this is what's happening to the body of Christ. You're consumed and you can't even move because you're asleep. You've given into the sleepy spirit. And so I said, I don't want to die that way. What do I do? I don't want to go to sleep. Like, what do I do? What do I do? And then God showed me what to do. And basically God said, you've got to wake yourself up. You got to wake yourself up. And there are 2 agents of awakening in the scriptures. One is love and the other is pain. Love and pain are deeply connected through discomfort. Discomfort, in embracing discomfort as an awakening agency is one of the greatest ways to wake yourself out of a sleep where that sleep is going to consume you by 1,000 things that don't even matter. So he gave me this like vision of me like falling asleep at the wheel in wintertime in Canada. I was driving home from a shift at night and I was doing all kinds of things to keep myself awake. You know, I was turning up the radio too loud. I was like pinching myself, and I was like slapping myself, like, wake up, you know, just like wake up, because I got to get home, and I'm falling asleep at the wheel. And then the middle of Canada, you know, everybody knows not to do this, but I wind down my window and stick my head out, you know, this cold, you know, just all this cold is like freezing my eyes open so I can get home to get to bed. And God said to me, do that. Do that. It seems ridiculous. If someone was watching me from another car, they'd be like, what's wrong with that person? You know, but actually what's right about that person is they're willing to do whatever it takes to stay awake so they don't die. And especially so they don't die some meaningless way. And that's literally when I moved to the downtown east side. I did it to embrace discomfort, to wake myself up out of a spiritual lethargy that was going to kill me. That the invitation is always there, because that cultural spirit has bitten all of us. You know, a Western spirit of comfort, of fat, of wealth, of upward ascension. You know, it's all just this like lull you to sleep spiritually. And we have to rage against it. And the only way to rage against it is to wake ourselves up. And one of the greatest ways to wake ourselves up is to live differently and live in a way that's uncomfortable, in order to awaken our spirits. And that's, you know, so it's less about, you know, I don't know if that's helpful to anybody. It's certainly changed my life, because I see now the bite, you know, I see the spider bite, the infection of the fat spirit in my life. And I want to live. I want to live. Yeah.
You know, I wrote a book during lockdown, unpublished book called The Satanic Lullaby and the Offensive Gospel. And it just ties in so much of what you're saying there. The phrase, the Satanic Lullaby, was an Iranian woman. And she and her husband had got through, if you like, to the promised land in the States. They'd got out of the persecution of Iran. And after a few months in in America, she says to her husband, darling, please take me back to Iran. There's a satanic lullaby in this nation. All the Christians have been lulled to sleep, and I feel myself being lulled to sleep. Mm-hmm. And when I heard that, that's the most powerful thing I think I've heard in the last several years. Mm-hmm. I was like, wow. And the fact is, she's not completely right. Not all the Christians are asleep, but a lot of us, certainly we are being lulled to sleep. And comfort is the perfect lullaby to be taken out.
Yeah.
And so we're on the same page there. Oh, my goodness. Lord, keep us awake.
I had in mind, in those days, spiritual survivor guide for the suburbs, mm-hmm. you know, like a spiritual survivor guide with that idea of like, yeah, that's probably something you should do. We should do. Maybe I could do the foreword or something with the spider dream or something. But that has been like a recipe for me where God's like, you've got to, I think just to acknowledge that you're being lulled. Because that's part of the awakening, right? Is you don't notice it. And then when you package it as part of the spiritual life, you know, which is like, this is God's gift to you. You know, I had a friend from Mali who came over, and we asked him what he thought. You know, after a while, we do some projects with him, and he said, "I just don't think this wealth is from God." That's what he said to us. I just don't think it's from God. I think what you think is blessing is actually not. And I think that was his warning to us, you know. Yeah.
The curse of comfort.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good.
Danielle, listen.
Do it. Write that book, Simon. Write it.
It's the longest podcast I've ever done because we try to keep it under an hour, but it's just so much gold in there. Listen, how can people be in touch with you, follow your stuff? We haven't mentioned any of your books, but they can go to is the best thing just to say, go to your blog?
Yeah, DanielleStrickland.com. Yeah.
All right.
Easiest.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate your time,
Thanks,
your pearls of wisdom, and God bless you so much, cheering you on. Keep up the great work.
This is fun. Such a good exercise to like stir me up, and I hope it's stirring us all up.
All right.
Bless
well,
you, Simon.
Listen, guys, if you've enjoyed it, please share this with other people. If you want to get in touch with me, simongilbert.com. I want to thank Adam Thomas-Steer for the editing, Mike Sandeman for the mixing. Next week, another fantastic guest, very different, all such different stories. But in the meantime, God bless and toodaloo.